Good evening. Good evening. I'm Denise Bennetts. I'm a founding director of Bennetts Associates. I'm pleased to welcome you to Hidden from History, the Royal Shakespeare Theatre. This is the third in a series of 4 lectures produced by AAX 100, which is organising the celebration of 100 years since women were admitted to the AA in 1917. The centennial celebration in 2017 will culminate with an exhibition, an international conference, and the AA will be publishing a book of critical and historical writing about AA women. The project is being organised by a group of AA students, staff, graduates, and others. So if there's anyone here who is willing to contribute, I'm sure they would welcome any approach that you would make to them. The initial lecture series introduces a wide range of topics and concerns, but this evening we're focusing on one architect, Elisabeth Scott, an early graduate of the AA in 1924, and one building, the Royal Shakespeare Theatre in Stratford-upon Avon. 3 years after graduating, Scott won the open competition for the Shakespeare Memorial Theatre, and when opened in 1932, the architecture was acclaimed, one of the 10 most important buildings of the decade, as was the fact that this was the first important work erected in the UK from the designs of a woman architect. In the subsequent decades, appreciation of the theatre declined, and Elisabeth Scott, her career and her achievements was lost to general view. The theatre itself has been reworked, and so this evening our speakers, Gillian Darley, Peter Wilson, and Simon Erridge, will pull together the strands of history and architecture, conservation and reuse, and reconsider the achievement of a pioneer AA woman and the afterlife of her architecture. The format for the evening is that our 3 speakers will talk with images, and then there will be a discussion, and we will welcome questions and points of view from the floor. I'd like to actually just explain a little bit more about our speakers, if you may need it. Gillian Darley. Gillian's a journalist, a writer, and a broadcaster, and took over as chair of the 20th Century Society last year. When the RST reopened in 2011, she presented a 45-minute BBC Radio 3 programme on Elisabeth Scott, accompanied by an essay in The Guardian Saturday Review entitled A Stage of Her Own. Well worth sourcing if you haven't already done so. Peter Wilson. Peter studied natural sciences at Cambridge, worked briefly in industry before embarking on a 30-year career in museums, which culminated in his role as Director of Projects for Tate, where he managed a series of projects beginning with Tate St Ives and ending with Tate Modern. In 2005, he joined the RSC as Project Director for the transformation of the Royal Shakespeare Theatre. He now advises clients on arts projects around the world. Simon studied at the University of Bath and joined Bennetts Associates 24 years ago, which seems quite surprising. He's worked on a very wide, diverse range of projects, offices to hotels, factories to libraries, as well as theatres and historic buildings. Simon worked on the first theatre we were commissioned, which was Hampstead Theatre and Swiss Cottage. We were commissioned because we had never designed a theatre before, which is something that we share with Elisabeth Scott. Subsequently, he led the team responsible for the transformation of the RST, and is currently working with the Old Vic in London and Chester Theatre and Library. So I would like to introduce Gillian, just to put into context the position of Elisabeth Scott, the architect.
Well, thank you, Denise. This all began, let me just sort myself out. So this is, got it, I think, no? It's the smallest print you ever did see. It's gone. Okay. Right. I was worried by that mountain, but it's gone. It all started with a radio program, which is an odd way to set off in a semi-biographical pursuit. But B.T. Rubins was making a series to mark the opening of the new theatre at Stratford, the theatre of the Royal Shakespeare Company, and somewhere along the line, she noticed this name lurking in the margins, Elisabeth Scott, who designed the original theatre. And she thought, something there to do, somebody to sort of bring out of the woodwork. And so, with the wonderful luxury of 45 minutes, we made a radio program, and we managed to find just enough people surviving to sort of bring the whole story jumping to life, I think. Perhaps the best of all was a member of her family in her early 90s who said, I remember, we ran downstairs at home shouting, Aunt Elizabeth won the competition. And, you know, when you hear that at a huge interval of time, it gives you a real, cause for, almost makes you cry. Anyway, here's the family. Luckily, there's a little family document written by her brother Tom, who is there on the right, who was a doctor. The Scotts were a kind of dynasty of architects and doctors, but actually this branch of the family had very little to do, as far as I could see, with the Gilbert Scotts and Adrian Scott and the further members of that branch of the family. I think I'm right in saying Elizabeth was the great niece of George Gilbert Scott. But her father was a doctor, and if you look through that, along that line, it's a two-part family. The adults at the back, everybody worked. The women went into nursing, professional nursing, and at the front you have the three boys and Elizabeth, who is known as Billy, and they were a sort of cohort, those four in the front. Eventually, there was another child coming. I would say she's one of 9 or 10, I think 9. So she was somebody who was brought up in that upper middle class professional way with a little added something, the something being everybody had something to pursue, and probably medicine was the easy one for, anyway, the girls. Elizabeth went to the AA in 1919, but in fact, from that photograph that you've just seen, 1911, in 1916, a thunderbolt fell, as on so many families. There were 2 boys who fought in the First World War, but the eldest son, Bernie, the one on the left, a spectacularly good-looking young man, was killed at Vimy Ridge, and the family was shattered by that. The eldest son, who fought in the First World War, stayed on the Western Front right the way through. So that whole generation were mature in certain ways, far beyond, I think, anything that we can imagine now. And Elizabeth, in fact, went off and she argued that she didn't want to be just educated at home. She went off for a year to a school in Bournemouth. And then rumor has it that she went and worked for a rather well-known left-wing politician. I have never been able to find out who that was. But the family was convincingly to the left, and I'll explain 1 or 2 other things too. And it wasn't until 1919 that architecture became her direction. And these sort of random pictures taken from the online selection here. On the left is a studio which is largely men, but there are 2 women there, one with an Eton crop, which she had. In fact, there might be 3 women in that one. The one on the right, a sort of more of a drawing room scene, men and women together. And then it only really occurred to me when sort of fishing out these pictures that, of course, the AA was absolutely imbued with theatre. They were always sorting out extraordinary costumes, going off to the Chelsea Arts Ball, pantomimes, the whole business of theatre. And I also discovered that apparently in her Who's Who entry, she gave her interests as theatre and music. So there she was. I mean, I'm not imagining, given that by all accounts she was a very sort of retiring person, that she actually was one of those figures dressed up, horsing about at the top, but who knows, maybe she was. Her year, so she was at the AA from 1919 to 1924, included two key figures for our story. On the left, an Italian embassy designed by someone who was always known as Jock Shepherd. And on the right is a rather extraordinary hotel by Alison Slay. I think she's pronounced Sly, actually, who was a New Zealand student who was, they were all in the same year, and eventually, not that eventually, she became Mrs. Shepherd. And when you look at Summerson's George in London, the wonderful, all the drawings in George in London are by Alison Shepherd, who is the hand on the right. In 1927, after, as far as, I don't know how long Elisabeth spent in two rather kind of interesting offices. One was Louis de Soissons in Welwyn Garden City. So you could imagine if she was there, let's say in 1925, she might have been involved in, who knows, the shredded wheat factory, or Beaux-Arts planning schemes, housing, who knows. And she also worked at some point for Oliver Hill. And I think what's interesting in both those offices, there was a very, to our eye anyway, a very strange sort of passage of different types of work, different styles, different commissions, different approaches, which seemed to be tailored to the particular of the commission itself. In 1927, a competition was announced, an international competition was announced. It was international, I think, particularly because the Shakespeare Memorial Theatre, which had undergone a catastrophe, a fire, although George Bernard Shaw, who's sort of on the sidelines almost throughout this story, said it was an admirable building, suitable for everything except being a theatre. So that was the one that burned down. And it wasn't really mourned, but it was obviously a catastrophe for the company. And fundraising began very quickly in the US. And I think the international element of this competition really was to keep the two, it's a very Anglophone set of entries. And people came from North America and Canada, but I don't think there were any Europeans entering. 70 plus entrants were corralled. It was the competition was run by Guy Dorber, who was president of the RIBA, and a distinguished American architect was an exchange, but it ended up as Raymond Hood was one of the judging panel. Here are 4 of the 6 finalists. As you can see, I'm sorry, not 4, 3. Sorry, the one on the left being a section as well. As you can see, they are of a diverse and rather extraordinary nature. 2 more which, in fact, bear, I think, much more resemblance to the winning entry. And the winning entry, which is a drawing by Elisabeth Scott of a stone masonry-built building seen, and this is the crucial point, from the water, across the water, because at every point the argument she made for the building and what it brought out of her and her team, because it was a team effort, was evinced by this landscape, this very particular site along the water. I mean, no London theatre, until the National, that is, has ever had the happy sight of being bang on the water. Elisabeth Scott was the lead participant in the group who won the competition. And in January 1928, the Times ran quite a long interview, or rather feature, and it quotes her in particular. what had happened was that she had begun to work with Maurice Chesterton, who was her tutor here, and I'm not sure if she was actually in his office when they put the competition in, but certainly from the minute that the competition was running, they were working as a practice. So it was Scott, Chesterton, and Shepherd, so Jock Shepherd, the other student. So it was a group effort, but it was Scott in front, and at all points, the particular quality of, as it were, the group endeavour was the fact that she took the initiative. And I think that's the thing that's quite often said by people who, in the 30s, there was quite a lot of, well, you know, who did build this? You know, who designed it? Who built it? Was it really? Well, she drove that scheme, and she could no more have built a theatre on a marsh than flown. It was a group effort at this point, and in fact it took a year and a half to get the scheme ready to the point of laying a foundation stone. Even the foundation stone was laid in water. But I'm just going to read very quickly what she said to the Times, and this is in January 1928, so fresh from the win. Miss Scott yesterday ascribed her early success in an important competition to the improved methods of training now available to young architects. In the last few years, she said, conditions of training have altogether changed. Formerly, young architects began their careers in offices where they spent a great deal of precious time, or a good deal of precious time, being useful about the place. But now they're able to enter schools and acquire theory from highly trained teachers. So although she doesn't say that it was at the Architectural Association that she gained this, that is what she's talking about. She's saying that she'd had opportunities that had not been available to her peer group before that. The models, I think you'll see other images of the models. The models were worked up. Chesterton certainly helped construct the first set of models. There's another one from the waterside and the section there. And as things were progressing, it was the fact that Elisabeth Scott was this really a real first-timer, the first woman to build a major cultural public building. And the press coverage was extraordinary. If you, in fact, go to the offices in Stratford, you can see volume upon volume of just press cuttings when the news broke. And every single headline, bar hardly any, says, Miss Scott, daughter of, Miss Scott, member of the family. I mean, always somehow kind of hedged about by explanations. But in the world of indomitable women, and here they are, I would love somebody to tell me who they all are. One of them is Miss Strachey, who was a heroic figure, but sitting in the chair of honour is, of course, our heroine, Elisabeth Scott, who, despite the fact she looks close on 72 there, is in fact not yet 30 and doesn't have the vote. And this is, I mean, it's, again, it is extraordinary to think that, you know, in the 1928, it wasn't until she turned 30 in September of that year, she then got her vote. So, but she was able to win an international competition. And through that network, and this is really where I'm going to leave the theatre for Peter and Simon to talk about in detail. But she was gaining other work as it went along. And I like this. This is the Marie Curie Hospital, Cancer Hospital. The British Journal of Nursing in July 29, so only a year after construction had begun at Stratford, No, actually, sorry, the year that the construction began, so she'd been planning the theatre, but it hadn't begun. It says rather charmingly in the British Journal of Nursing, the Marie Curie Cancer Hospital, which is exclusively for women, run by women, and named after a woman, is to be opened in Fitzjohn's Avenue. It's hoped to be ready in the autumn, etc., etc. Miss Elisabeth Scott, the architect who designed the Shakespeare Memorial Theatre, is making the plans for the alteration of the house. So that was one of her first considerable jobs. And while it's not possible to really know what she did to the house, beyond presumably extend at the back a large Fitzjohn's Avenue, classic sort of turn of the century, halfway to a mansion, she must have had a very considerable grasp of technology, and I mean this was a very innovatory building for women in the advanced stages of cancer for their treatment with residential and I think it was a mixture of a drop-in centre, as it were, for treatment and a residential. We get to April 1932, and the theatre, Shakespeare's birthday, the theatre is finished. There is Elisabeth Scott presenting the keys to the Prince. The Prince had flown himself in. Seems rather characteristic, doesn't it? They always seem to fly themselves in. And standing facing us is Chesterton, and looking rather shy and retiring on the right is Jock Shepherd. And I just found this rather jolly picture on the left from the sketch, which was of girls and boys presenting the same Prince with T-squares in Bedford Square on his visit. I'm not sure of the date, but I like to think that perhaps maybe even Elizabeth was there with a T-square presenting arms, ho-ho. But that's what AA students did in, let's say, about 1930. And the patronage of women, of a woman by women, went on. And through the same networks, this very jolly picture of her in a little toque is from the moment when the Fawcett building of Newnham College, which is shown above, was opened. And I think you can see that this is somebody, I mean, I think de Soissons kind of pops up there. I feel that's quite a de Soissons sort of building. It obviously was an extension to Basil Champney's existing building. It had to be of a piece with it, and it was thought to be a very pleasant extension. Was Elisabeth Scott more of a modernist, less of a modernist? I mean, quite frankly, who cares? I think when you look in detail at the building, she was quite a few things anyway, and of course she was able and willing to share her patronage with a number of artists as well, and again, that will come through. That is what happened to the Marie Curie Hospital, and that's why there are no, as far as I can see, no other images of it whatsoever. That extraordinary picture, which belongs to the Imperial War Museum, shows them checking for radioactive material because it had been bombed to smithereens, and they did not know where the radioactive material was. And nor really, from this period on, do we know very much about where Elisabeth Scott was either. She hit, as of course, particularly women. I mean, her professional partners were called up into engineering, and she had to struggle on. She was doing a school in North Yorkshire. She had great trouble getting building materials and licenses and so on. And she gradually sort of was beaten back, really, by the restrictions of wartime, the professional and material restrictions, both. She married in 1936, rather oddly. She married her sister's brother-in-law, who was really, it would seem, a ne'er-do-well. She supported him for the rest of their lives. and lived in Bournemouth. And in Bournemouth, she joined the office of the borough architect. And this theatre, on the end of the pier, which is now an all-weather sports centre as of the last year, apparently in such a way that it could return to theatrical use. However, that's what it is, the Rock and Something Outdoor Centre, and that is her most notable work in Bournemouth, and designed in the late 50s and built in 1960. And there is something really rather poignant about this journey from a person of absolutely international fame for a little window in the 1930s, and then the person who was working away in the corner of the Bournemouth architect's office, who nobody knew that she'd ever done another theatre. I mean, we met people when we were making the programme, and they remembered her, and she handed around the biscuits and went back into her corner, and she never spoke of what her achievements had been. So now let's talk about her achievements.
Thanks, Gillian. Now I need to change this. Try the escape button. There it is. It's got a background. We're going to start with another picture of Elisabeth you haven't seen. This is probably around the time that she won the competition, 3 years after graduating from the AA. We're going to go on to talk a bit about the theatre in Stratford and the history of the theatre in Stratford, how it emerged on that site, how the competition emerged, the building, its design, and how it was received after it was built. And then our opportunity to revisit that building 70 years later, and what we were able to do to make it a theatre fit for the 21st century, and particularly for the performance of Shakespeare. Peter, do you want to start by talking a bit about this slide?
I think I'll just say a little bit by way of background about Stratford. Obviously, Shakespeare was born there, and eventually he was married there, and then he died there. And in the 200 years leading up to 1769, people, wealthy people, used to visit there as part of a national grand tour. So it was on the UK tour, for a cultural tour for wealthy people travelling around England, and the reason they went there was they went to Holy Trinity Church to see Shakespeare's tomb, and later on, actually rather later on even than this, they started visiting there to see the house where he was born. And there are several houses left in Stratford that are associated with Shakespeare's life, but in 1769, Garrick, the theatre entrepreneur, I suppose you'd call him these days, was asked by the worthy burghers of Stratford to come and celebrate his bicentenary, and Garrick did that by putting on a performance in Stratford, and this is one image of what was built in the gardens near the theatre as part of that presentation. And by all accounts, it wasn't a very successful event because it rained the whole time, and the fireworks that were supposed to be associated with this event were kind of rained off. But in the following years, there was an increasing amount of interest in actually presenting Shakespeare's plays in Stratford. There's some evidence that Shakespeare himself performed in Stratford, and it became increasingly important for Stratford to have a theatre. So there was one attempt to do this in 1864, lasted a short while. That's this one in the gardens, long disappeared in. I think there's now that's Avonbank, isn't it, underneath there, which is a property development that kept the RSC going for a while. And eventually in 1873, a theatre was built, the Shakespeare Memorial Theatre, which had a regular summer season of plays.
So, yeah, so that theatre was a result of an architectural competition, which is another story altogether from this one. And obviously, being built in the late 19th century, it was built in the neo-Gothic style, which was very fashionable at the time. By the time we got to the mid-1920s, it was disliked. It wasn't thought to be an appropriate theatre for Shakespeare anymore. I think it had been criticised many times. And so I guess nobody was that upset. I'm going to skip this as a view from the tower of the of Holy Trinity Church, but it wasn't.
It was interesting, actually, that if you look at that previous slide, then can we go back one? No, another one.
Yep.
That was a library where you could learn about Shakespeare, a theatre, and something that was just pure tourism. It was just a tower that you could look at Stratford from, and it was stuck up in opposition to the Holy Trinity's tower, sort of waving at people coming off the train, saying, and if you come a bit further, there's something else to do here. So, and it was also built over an old canal basin, because Stratford wasn't a rural retreat in the intervening years. It was actually an industrial centre with the canal. And this theatre was you could say it was a really early piece of cultural regeneration.
So people paid a small amount of money to get the view, but then the inevitable happened in the mid-1920s, and a discarded cigarette led to the building burning down. And you can see everybody from Stratford out there watching it happening. Nobody was hurt. There was nobody in the building at the time. But I think it provided Stratford with then an opportunity to look at rebuilding a theatre in a contemporary style and creating a theatre that they thought would be appropriate for producing Shakespeare in the 1920s and 1930s. And
when it burnt down, George Bernard Shaw declared that he was heartily pleased to see it go.
so what resulted from that was the international competition that Gillian mentioned, and we saw some of the entries for that competition. But it's interesting to note when you look at this plan, so we have the River Avon above us here. Waterside is the road that forms the edge of the riverside setting for the Royal Shakespeare Theatre. That the new building, and this is Elisabeth Scott's plan here with its terracing around it. It's in a flood zone, so it needs to be built on a very sturdy base, and lots of complicated technology were involved in constructing that. Had to include the ruins of the old theatre. So what you see here is the old reading room and the old, really the old ruin, literally, of the old theatre space. And that was incorporated into the new building. So despite the fact that we were talking about creating a brand new theatre, there was a need to find a way of incorporating the ruins of the old. Now that may have been expediency. It was the late 1920s. You know, the Wall Street crash had happened. There was little money around, and this was going to be a very extravagant building, and they may have just decided we just need to keep it there for future reference. And as you can see, Elisabeth Scott's building sits very comfortably on the site. It straddles literally the geometry between the river and the road waterside, with its fan-shaped auditorium and its fly tower. And you can see the extent to which the landscape around it was also created at that time, and much of that still exists today. I mean, I think in a way, we were discussing earlier, Peter, weren't we, that this is a kind of theatre that was seen as being a summer festival theatre. It didn't have vast front-of-house spaces. It was like a Glyndebourne type space in a way.
Yeah, we were thinking earlier that didn't have this image, but if you were to look at a picture of Glyndebourne in the interval, with everyone out on the lawn enjoying themselves, that was the kind of thing that people intended for the relationship to the landscape for the Memorial Theatre. It was definitely a summer season place, and during its summer season, people would have expected to go outside and enjoy the landscape.
So the building very much referenced its facade facing the newly landscaped Bancroft Gardens. It also had a strong relationship with the riverside, as Gillian was saying earlier. But that meant that the piece of the building that faced the town was really treated as the back of the building, and that's where the stage deliveries happened, it's where the dressing rooms were, and so on. So it really was a building that faced out to the countryside and really almost turned its back on the town, and that's one of the issues that we really tried to address when we looked at the building again in the early 2000s.
People in the town called it the Jam Factory because the facade that faced the town was pretty workaday facade, and actually there were really good reasons for that. I mean, in the 19th century, people came in to this end of the town to a railway station, now long gone, and came down to see first of all Holy Trinity Church here and then on down. By the time Elisabeth Scott's building was built, the motor car was in ascendancy. Railways weren't that important. There was a huge coach park over here, and most people approached the theatre along the waterside and in that direction, not from the town.
And you can see that, again, the building embraced the motor car in that it had a car park in front of it and sweeping turns for turning around vehicles in front of the building. That was seen as an important innovation and one of the modern features of the building. If we look at the plan of the building, I mean, the first thing that strikes you is that fan shape, which is not just derived from the Avon and waterside, but it's also a function of the shape of the auditorium. I mean, it's interesting to recall that this building was designed probably only 10 years after Frank Matcham died. So we're talking about, 20 years earlier, we'd been building buildings like the Colosseum in the West End. This was a totally new approach to designing theatre. And the brief for the international competition was very specific about the nature of the auditorium. It required it to be a fan-shaped space. It required it to have a very considerable amount of stage machinery with wing space, really very much like an opera house would do today. Very strict sight lines for placing scenery on the side out of sight, bringing it in on a truck and taking it away again. And really a world away from the curving lines and the embracing forms of the theatres of the late Victorian era, which would have been seen as very old-fashioned at the time that this was designed. And really that auditorium shape has much more in common with contemporary cinema. So that was the kind of auditorium that were being built in large numbers in the 1920s and early 1930s. And the curious thing about those fan-shaped auditoria is that the rows get longer as you get further away. So the bulk of the audience is actually sitting a long way away from the stage. And that's a very desirable thing in cinema because you want a perspective on the screen. But in theatre, really I think we've come back to this view now, that successful theatre is as much about intimacy and about having a strong physical relationship with the action on stage, something that is very difficult to get in an auditorium of this form.
And you could conjecture, actually, that trying to think back into the minds of people, clients for theatres in those days, that they were fighting the cinema. The cinema was arriving. They wanted to have spaces that had the kind of atmosphere of the cinema, and they also had to deal with the fact that you needed, to be kind of modern, you needed scenery. So hence these huge wings and the ability to bring on three-dimensional scenery. It wasn't just a question of a backdrop or two. It had to be elaborate scenery. I mean, the technical guys, probably, as they always do in theatres, I've learned, probably had a field day with what they specified. And actually doesn't quite work, does it? Because not only what Simon says, that actually the rows at the back are longer, but also you've got to eat it, to get a sight line into the stage and to see what goes on, not on a screen, but behind it. You have to cut off these rows. So they get cut off, and there are even fewer people able to see. And I think this was the environment that Elisabeth Scott had to deal with. These were the imperatives not only of the theatre people, but also of the wealthy people who were sponsoring this theatre, was that they wanted it to be able to take on cinema.
Yeah, I mean, Raymond Hood, who was part of the jury, had just designed Radio City Music Hall in New York. So, there was a building that almost had that plan about it. But the rest of Scott's building literally wrapped that fan shape with public spaces. So the front of the building has a main entrance foyer, grand entrance foyer on the ground floor, with an entrance foyer addressing the dress circle on the upper floor. A very grand circulation stair of stone, which I'll show you some images of in the corner. It's probably the finest space in the building. And then a series of refreshment rooms along the riverside with bars and doors opening out onto the riverside terrace. And then on this side, which faces waterside, which faces the town, literally, we have all those functional spaces, dressing rooms, offices, and other things. And the original theatre really, literally just existed in this front section. The back was the ruin of the old theatre and a brick screen that had been constructed to conceal it from view, and some utilitarian backstage spaces. So really the new construction was quite limited in 1932, and the building extended a lot after that, and I'll show you how it developed when we come to that in a moment. If we take a look at back at Scott's model, so we see a building that reflects the sort of functional nature of the plan. We've got that circular stair on the corner. We've got the facade of that main foyer space. We've got a more functional set of rooms at the far end which contain loos, and the stairs up to the balcony, which was segregated, which was the fashion of the day, to have a separate queue on one side for the cheap tickets. The auditorium volume, that fan shape, projects out of the roof, and the fly tower is the massive structure that anchors it all together and still stands as the main external feature of the existing building. Along the riverside, she anticipated a whole series of terraces and steps, even taking visitors up onto the higher parts of the building that were never built in reality. I think budget was very, very tight, and they struggled to achieve the basis of this plan. The materials were changed as well, so eventually the building was constructed of brick. Now that might have been economy, it might have been because the burghers of Stratford decided a brick building was the right thing for Stratford rather than a stone one.
I think the record says that she was told, you've won the competition, but please can you use brick? And actually I think her original anticipation was a Cotswold stone, kind of Cotswolds building. And Stratford isn't really, Stratford's kind of South Birmingham. It had been an industrial place. There was the Flowers Brewery, where the money came from for the earlier theatre, from the Flowers family. And it probably was, I kind of imagine that she probably got on all right with it, because the brick gets used quite nicely.
Yeah, and in detailing the building in brick. So, I mean, essentially it looks very similar to the model, but the fine detailing of the facade, the vertical pilasters that are created from brick on edge are all created from standard bricks. There's very few special bricks in the building at all. And it compares well with the sort of, contemporary work of Charles Holden, for instance, in London, in terms of the inventive use of standard brick and coloured brick within the facade. And you can see in this view all those features I was describing earlier, the riverside room, the foyer and the stair on the corner and so on, and added a floodlight for dramatic effect. But that importance of that corner view with the reflection in the river is still very evident in that early photograph. Walking around the building, you can see how well detailed the external spaces are too. So that point about the external spaces being part of the experience, brick and stone detailing, terraces and steps, all in the consistent materials with the main building. This is actually the cheap seats. This is the queue for the cheap seats down the side of the building facing the town in anticipation of a large audience.
And with their own waterproofing.
Yeah, their own little canopy. But actually all around the building, so not only we've got that highly crafted brickwork, but we've also got, particularly in things like the doors, many different interesting materials used. The doors on the left there, the main entrance doors with aluminium and bronze. These decorated doors here in timber and copper, and screens and canopies all picked out in very intricate details. It's a highly crafted building. You can see the inventive use of brick here around those canopy and main entrance doors to the foyer. And internally, doors commissioned and individually designed. Door handles here commissioned by the theatre by the artist Gertrude Hermes, who worked with Scott in a number of aspects of the building, both on those and in the fountain staircase. This is that dramatic drum internally. So we're using brick in an inventive way here as well to create those drum walls. We're using Swedish green marble overlap to construct that staircase, and stepping a brass handrail in a very inventive way around the edges of the staircase. So a very dramatic space with a slightly curious sculpture in the middle, which is it's almost a wishing well. It's used as part of the Shakespeare birthday commemorations, but sits as a centerpiece in the floor of that rather extraordinary space. You get a sense of the kind of the austere, but with elements of high decoration. Here, also by Gertrude Hermes, the finger plates for the main auditorium doors with these comedy and tragedy masks that unfortunately were long lost when we arrived in the building in 2005.
Which is unfortunately a feature of working in theatres, in that theatre people don't respect fabric in the way that you might think that they would. There are a few theatre people, especially in the Shakespeare theatre, who like history, but actually they treat everything as ephemeral. And if you turn your back on a detail that's about to be removed from the building, you'll find it's not there. And we had to work quite hard to keep the things we were dismantling later on. And you can well imagine that they probably graced some theatre person's drawing room in the intervening years.
And this is the main auditorium itself. So again, lavishly designed drop curtain, completely designed joinery encasing the auditorium and the proscenium edge in a way that really restricts the theatre director's territory to literally that frame. I mean, this is architecture which is very much framing the theatrical experience. It's very different from the kind of approach that you get working with theatre today, where the auditorium architect is almost destined to be recessive, to be able to work with the theatre designer rather than to create a frame within which to contain it.
Theatre people call the difference between this kind of theatre and a contemporary one. They call it one-room and two-room theatres. That kind of theatre, there's a room behind the curtain where the actors stand, and they talk into another room where the audience is, and there's kind of a no-go zone between them, and that creates all sorts of acoustic difficulties, and it also creates the difficulty that you can never overcome in the difference between cinema and theatre, which is that in cinema, the head can fill the screen and it can talk to you. So it doesn't matter how far you are away in the cinema, you can create a cinematically intimate experience, but you can't do that in theatre because people are the same size, whether you're in the front row or the back row. So they're microscopic when you're at the back. And they're also shouting at you from another room, which itself generates a kind of theatrical performance that is no longer fashionable.
I think these things go in cycles, don't they? I mean, at the moment, we're very much into intimacy and theatre in the round and thrust stage. I think it's a 50-year cycle. We may be building fan stage, end stage, if theatre direction goes that way in the future. But it just shows you how auditoria, in a way, need to be adaptable spaces. And this is really very much not that. I mean, it's a very finely crafted, beautifully detailed space, as you can see. None of this existed. Most of this was stripped out. Even shortly after the Second World War, with many changes that were made to this space. But you can just get a sense of the craft and the quality of design in that space. The foyer spaces themselves, again, going back to those elements of very intricate metalwork, this extraordinary stone floor with three different British stones used, aluminium cornicing with concealed lighting, all of these things, incredible amounts of detail. And looking back into the same space, with the clock at the end, which still exists today. So let's wind the clock forward to 2005, when 10 years ago, we began working on the building. And it was just about possible to discern the quality of some of those spaces behind the sort of detritus that had been added over the years. And I suppose this reflects the nature of change in theatre over that period of time, that theatre organisations like the RST needed to sell trinkets to people, to sell tickets in greater quantities, to invite people into the building all day. And so those minimal spaces that had already been designed as those, in connection with breakout spaces outside and external foyers and so on, had suddenly had to work extremely hard. And we resulted in this building which was absolutely cluttered with every piece of display material and other things, desks and other things that you could possibly imagine, but barely discernible behind that was Elisabeth Scott's foyer space. Along the riverside, this is actually going back to 1932, the brick piers hiding the ruined old theatre and Scott's building. That very sculptural shot, they're using sunlight beautifully to capture the three-dimensional qualities of the foyer, of the fly tower, the wing space here, the foyer spaces in the auditorium. And by 1938, Scott herself had been commissioned to extend the building. So these terraces were added. I think by that time, the success of the theatre had meant that it was operating all year round, not just in the summer, and more foyer space was required. But it's quite interesting to note that the way she tackled that was very different from the original building. These are horizontal planes. They cut right across her earlier facade. And I think they probably reflect a change in architectural taste that had taken place over that time.
I think they clearly did, and actually black and white doesn't do justice to how different this is, because you can find coloured plates of this, and it's actually a pastel building with lemon yellow and pale blue and pink and all sorts of colours decorating that facade. And actually reminded me of Gillian of the pier later on. There's obviously a connection between what she came to do then and what happened later.
So by 2005 again, that view in Beautiful Sunlight we changed to had become those extensions, not only the 1938 one but further ones, had essentially almost completely blocked the riverside, and it was no longer possible to make that walk along the river edge between the building and the river, which is such an important part of visiting Stratford. The facade of the building, the main facade facing the Bancroft Gardens, here it is again in glorious sunlight. This shot probably taken about 6 o'clock in the morning. This is the north side of the building. What you can see here is carved in situ sculptures by Eric Kennington, this rather extraordinary umbrella lamp standards, everything designed in detail in this building. These beautiful cantilevered canopies here, featuring that overlapping detail very similar to the one used in the fountain staircase. So by 2005, what started as a car park for 30 cars, it ended up being 100 cars with its own reinforced GRC parking booth. The building had been covered in flags. The foyer had been extended out under the canopy, so just to create more space, so the canopy no longer had that quality of being a cantilevered item of the building. So really a lot of that character had got lost.
And even the poor lamppost has suffered the indignity of having a banner hanging system attached to it.
So within the auditorium, that's just flipping back to 1932. Really, ever since that time, I think theatre people had struggled with how to make this auditorium work, particularly for Shakespeare, where the spoken word and eye contact is such an important part of getting the message across. So incrementally, over the years, the auditorium had been completely transformed. And this is what it looked like in 2005. So we just get a sense here, almost from the same viewpoint, that all of the timbers have been removed, apart from some of the doors, which were retained. The balcony, the side balcony is extended along the side walls just to try and get some audience closer to the edge of the stage to get that contact. There's a 4-stage been built to bring
You can see how
the stage
they
out.
tried to get out past the proscenium arch, and in doing so they needed to create seats at the sides for box office reasons to cope with the ones they'd taken away and keep the numbers up. So I think it's easy to show two pictures like this, one from 1930 and one from, I don't know when this was, the 80s, 90s,
well, this
maybe even right
yeah.
at the end. But actually, so many years in between and so much incremental change. This didn't happen just like that. This happened very slowly over quite a long time. And I don't think there was anyone working in the theatre when we all turned up to work on it who could really remember that it was meant to be something else originally. This is what they didn't like. It wasn't what it had started like. It was this.
It's what it ended
that
like.
they'd done for themselves, actually, by just this constant collage of adding stuff all over the place.
So from Scott's original plan in 1932, the plan looked like this when we started working on the project. So riverside extension, lots of new construction around the back of the building here. The old theatre had been turned once into a conference hall and then into the Swan Theatre, which more of in a moment. But the old Victorian picture gallery still remains, and Scott's original fan-shaped auditorium with the foyer spaces wrapping around it, pretty much in their original condition underneath all of the other bits and pieces that have been added over the years. I think the thing that really changed the RSC's view about the auditorium was this building, which is the Swan Theatre, which was built in the mid-1980s in that ruined old theatre, so literally taking the shape of the old 1879 theatre and building within the brick walls. And this represented what people were beginning to think theatre of Shakespeare's day was more like. So remembering that this is really a theatre for Shakespeare's work and Shakespeare's contemporaries, they had found that constructing this ad hoc theatre within a shell, they were able to create a space which had more theatrical magic about it, whatever that is, but it had more theatrical magic about it than the other big house they had, and that there were directors queuing up to put work on in this theatre, but it was very difficult to get people to put work on in the other theatre. So we were charged with developing a new auditorium for the main house, which had that characteristic of the Swan about it. So a thrust stage, galleried auditorium, very much in the idiom of the Globe in London, but adapted for an internal space. The Swan was only 400 seats. The new Royal Shakespeare Theatre was to be 1,000 seats, so we had work to do to expand that. And our work was further complicated by the fact that clearly we had to fit this new auditorium within the shell of Elisabeth Scott's building, which of course was protected and was a key part of the building's history. So we developed a plan where we really looked at transplanting the whole of the centre of the building, so creating that new auditorium sitting within the space, connecting it to the existing fly tower and those wing spaces, but constructing a new wing of dressing rooms, an auditorium that sat almost as a building within Scott's building. Then stripping out her auditorium, which of course had been pretty much destroyed over the previous 70 years, to reveal the best of her existing foyer spaces, and to try and return the external appearance very close to the appearance of 1932. We also added considerable amounts of foyer space on the south side of the building too, so new foyers that connected the two theatres together, and that allowed us to take all of that clutter away from Scott's building and demolish the Riverside building that had been added later.
And turn it round so that it faced towards the town as well.
Indeed.
Which was quite an important message to give Stratfordians who are deeply conservative people, and however bad things are, they don't like it to change. So we had to work quite hard to persuade them that what we were doing wasn't all bad.
So this is a diagram of the scheme. New auditorium sitting in the middle of the space, Scott's foyer is wrapping around the outside with the fountain staircase on the corner. Our new foyer space, our new viewing tower, which is something that picked up on that 1879 viewing tower, gave people a view of Stratford in the 21st century, but still sitting within that strong base of brick and stone, still the original layout from Scott's 1932 building. So this is literally new building sitting within old. So this is demolishing the fan-shaped auditorium inside, constructing a new concrete and steel auditorium within that. So quite an engineering feat in its own right. We worked through several options of the auditorium. We went through several versions of quite large-scale models with the theatre team in order to get a final solution that was worked as effectively, if not more effectively, than the Swan, but with more than double the amount of seats.
And it's worth recording. I spent most of my life working in the visual arts, where everyone can read a plan, and everyone understands what, from architectural plans, what they're going to get. Theatre people don't. They all work from models. They need to see it in 3 dimensions. You have to work with models. Yeah. And that's just a cultural difference between those kinds of organisations. And you just have to do this thing. And it's no good doing it in fly-throughs or anything like that. They make themselves stage models. They work with models. They expect that to be the means of communication with them.
So this was the resulting auditorium, and as you can see, it couldn't be more different from the auditorium of 1932. It's 1,000 seats, so it's about the same scale, slightly smaller than the original 1932 auditorium. But here
although the original, and we didn't cover the fact that they extended the auditorium, but it actually ended up being more than 1,400 seats, because they made some even worse seats right at the back, even further up, that were just appalling, and nothing to do with Elisabeth Scott's auditorium. They were an extra 6 metres, probably 7 metres away from the stage.
And so it's a million miles away from the kind of fine veneered finishes of the 1930s theatre too. This is a theatre made of bare metal with solid timber, because it's a theatre that actors climb around and they knock with their swords and they bash it to make noise and so on. It's a very, very different kind of theatre to the type that would have been prevalent in the 1930s.
It's one room.
And the auditorium is literally wrapped around the walls, literally 4 or 5 rows deep, piled up around the edges of the space. So a very intense experience, very, very close to the action, very different from the earlier building. And if you look at the cross-section, this is the cross-section of the building. Actually, this is the 2005 version, so these are the seats that were added at the back.
This is the extra bit at the back, this really distant piece.
At this point, you were 30 metres away from the forestage, and this is where the school parties used to go as well. So it was a very, very difficult place to experience Shakespeare. Although the bones of Scott's building are still there, the auditorium has changed beyond recognition. And our approach was to construct that new auditorium sitting within the space. It's got its own fly tower above the stage, its own basement below that as well. So it's a very 3-dimensional form of theatre. But to sit that within Scott's foyers here and behind her original fly tower, literally slotting it inside the old building. Because we were able to create more space on the town side of the building to create this linking foyer, we were able to free space up on the riverside too. So that gave us the opportunity to strip back all the accretions that had been added around those important north and west-facing parts of the building that are so important to Scott's original scheme. And so we pulled the building right back to its original facade. We revealed this facade that had been completely built over only 8 years after its original construction by Scott's new building.
Also through, in that there were massive holes in it where the structure had been tied, of the new bit had been tied back into it. So it's a big restoration job.
We sourced original crystal windows, we replaced metalwork that was part of the original building and have sat beneath a new roof and a new back of house extension. So literally embracing those original Scott features and building, reconstructing brick walls forming that strong base around the building facing the Avon. So you really get a sense of, in a way, the intricacy and detail of that original facade coming to life again. And of course now, without a building built across it, this is now a busy thoroughfare. It's wide, it's very clear and open as a walkway past the building, and is absolutely the busiest cafe in the RSC, is the one that sits on the riverside at this point. So around the north side, again, we got up early in the morning to take this shot as well, but that shows how stripping away those the glass house that had been built under the canopy reveals its original cantilever. And above the building, where the old balcony had been, those really terrible seats 30 metres away, built a restaurant with a new roof over the top of that. So you're again embracing over the top of Scott's rather wonderful brick foyer from the 1930s.
And even those doors, aluminium and bronze doors, had been painted British racing green, and you could barely see what they were made of. They were so thick with years and years of green paint.
So here you can see again new aluminium cladding underneath the canopy with bronze sections as well. So echoing that original detail with the multicoloured bricks being used in piers beside the doors. And that foyer space, so we cleared out all of those accretions. We put a new bar back in. We restored the old pay box to its original location and repainted all the cornices in silver rather than dark green. To recreate something of the spirit of those original photographs of that space. And this is now a bar. It's no longer the main entrance to the building. We've created that around the side of the building. This is now a bar, a breakout bar for the ground floor of the building. And getting an idea there of just the intricacy, the Swedish green marble, copper and stainless steel being used to effect in the design of the old ticket booth. And finally, the fountain staircase, with its green marble and its statue and its sculpture that we've had cleaned and the mosaic around it. So that really a space which, apart from the handrail, which was added for safety reasons, probably in the post-war years, is in a sense the same as the original photos. And above it, the old balcony foyer, which has been converted into an individual dining room as part of our restaurant on the top of the building. Then the space between the two, so this is literally Scott's timber fins. They used to lead into the dress circle of the old auditorium. Now we have a void in the building filled with our new auditorium. So our new building, our new brick auditorium with circulation spaces around it literally fits and slots within the volume vacated by the old one, leaving a gap all the way around the edges. And finally, that's the three-quarter view from the river with nice reflections on a calm day. So that's how the building sits today.
Rare calm Stratford day.
Yes. So thank you. On this side? Do you want to do this? Okay.
The only architectural item I was going to add was going back to the one-room and two-room discussion. And one of the final images there, crossing the void to the new auditorium and the circulation route. Of course, it's now lined by a curtain. So it used to be that the curtain was at the proscenium arch. the actors were in one room, the audience in the other. This time, the audience passes through the curtain to join the actors in the room. So,
And behind the curtain, there are all sorts of useful things like spaces for props and spaces for quick change for actors. And because this new theatre wants to reveal its processes, at the interval, those curtains are sometimes pulled back so that you can see the bowl of blood and the spear through the hand and the costumes. And the secret, you know, the magic these days is not that you believe it, it's that you see how it's done. And that's a different culture from the previous one.
I think it's rather interesting, all the little asides and insights that you've given to you're dealing with the client, I should say, all of you. It sort of stands in such contrast, or does it, with Elisabeth Scott's dealings with her clients, who were, in many ways, a nightmare. I mean, she had to travel around Germany with Archie Flower, who was probably, I mean, you know, this brewer who was the Lord Lieutenant of the county type, even if he wasn't. Possibly quite a nice man, but, you know, there she was, not yet 30, travelling with these people, the sort of artistic director who thought he should have done it himself and who sniped continually from the sidelines. I mean, that's the moment when I really, that's when my admiration knows very few bounds, because to deal with all that, I mean, even if she had her old tutor, Maurice Chesterton, sort of at her side and her good friends, you know, working with her, she's the one who took all the barbs and all the personal insults. And you know, the Elgar story, which is, you know, I mean, it's funny if it wasn't awful, where he said, I'm not going to go into that building. Elgar refused, probably because his music was actually, you know, kind of failing, and he wasn't up to the job, and he'd just turned 70. And he said, I'm not going to go into the building because of that awful woman. And then, you know, he left that sort of on the page for people to read, and, you know, and she had to just keep dealing with these sort of slings and arrows. So why shouldn't she have had, you know, the bouquets as well when it opened? I mean, that seemed to be very reasonable payback.
Yes. I mean, conscious of the fact that this is being recorded and rebroadcast, I won't tell you too much about the parallels between her world and ours. But I can tell you, after a lifetime of working in the arts projects are never easy. There are all sorts of constituencies. There are wealthy people that you depend on for funds. There are quite determined people in senior positions inside museums, and there's also a whole host of technical people who have very, very, very determined agendas about what they're going to get within the building. And these things are all difficult. And if you are young and a woman in a world that was probably completely dominated by men, you didn't see many women in the lists of people who are involved from the client side at that time. It must have been pretty difficult. It's still difficult, but it would have been harder then.
I mean, the unfortunate thing is that the selection seems to have been gender neutral, and then we went backwards from there, because, you know, we were talking about collaboration, and clearly she collaborated with many artists and craftspeople in the development and the delivery of the project.
She chose Eric Kennington, that was definitely hers, and Gertrude Hermes too. So the sort of the patronage that she had in her own, by that point in her own shoes, was I think rather well exercised.
She seems to have been good at collaborating.
Yes. Can I ask for Lynn?
Could I just come in on what Gillian said there? I think one of the things that's interesting to me, just an AA connection perhaps, is that she hired Janet Pott, as she became Janet Fletcher, whose father was actually the architect who, when he was head of AA Council, engineered, I'm going to use that word, women into the AA in 1917. It was he was in charge with young women architects. A good role model for that, I would say.
Absolutely. I mean,
the collaboration thing is a strong point, because that's as relevant now.
Excuse me, Adam. I was wondering if you could go closer to your microphones, because I'm not...
Okay, how about that? Can you hear that? Okay. I was just saying collaboration is as strong an issue today as it was then. I'm sure you can, when you look at that building and you look at the technical complexity of what had to be done, that couldn't ever be the work of one individual person. And I think, you can imagine that a team requiring to work on that, but her being in charge of that team, and it takes a particular kind of person to be able to lead a team in that way and to direct a project that was obviously as well executed as the RST was. I think that's obviously the quality she brought to it. I think, and aside from the issue of travelling Europe, just the complexity of working in Stratford-upon Avon from an office in Hampstead in 1929 must have been quite tricky as well, I'm guessing. I mean, I don't know how much time she spent up there. It's, you can imagine it was a long and difficult process.
Absolutely so.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's interesting. She went to Germany to look at theatres, and that was a journey she had to do with Flower and possibly with the artistic director. But and she says in print, in interviews, what she'd been looking at beforehand, and she'd looked at Perret. And when I was looking at those interiors, that seems to me that's where she sits. If you want to slot her into a kind of modernism, that's where she is. And she looked at a German theatre designer also on the page, and somebody in the States she was rather taken by, and I'm trying to remember who. So she was looking widely and presumably just going through runs of the magazines to sort of see at that stage what was being done that was breaking new ground.
The other thing which I thought was interesting was that she did declare that she was a modernist, and that, the building had to function. And she referenced sight lines and acoustics and such like, but then she also talked about the nature of the volumes and the space being open and welcoming and giving people a sense of occasion. And in many respects, I think, if you think about what was happening with Matcham, etc., and even now, when we opened Hampstead Theatre, we had architectural critics complaining that the foyer spaces were too light and open, and that they should be dark and compressed. But here we had Scott in the late 20s going, no, the foyers should be open and welcoming. And suddenly, within about 15 years from the last Matcham Theatre opening, she was applying quite an interesting thought process to the nature of the volumes.
Yeah, it has more in common with the festival hall than it
Much
does with
more.
Yeah, I was
Yes.
thinking
Coliseum,
exactly
doesn't it?
that.
Yes.
Yeah. It's a pity the war got in the way,
Yeah.
wasn't it, really?
Yeah.
Because if it wasn't for
Yeah.
the war, you'd see a continuity through to the 1950s, which doesn't exist because there isn't anything in between.
I mean, I think the other thing that speaks to her, in this sort of slightly picky corner where people say, well, how much did she do and what was the relationship between them? The fact that she was the one who came back and did more work and, was called back, I think, 36, 38, several different phases of work. They went back to her. Well, if she'd in any way sort of, caught them short, sort of sold them short, I should say, they would surely not have gone back to her. So that says much, I think, for her professional delivery. She was worth, she was worth a return.
Absolutely. Can I invite any questions or comments from the audience?
Following on the point about them going back to her, there was a different ethic, wasn't there, in those days, where if you designed a building, it remained yours, and any subsequent architect had to, if they were invited to make any difference to it or any alterations, had to get your permission in order to do that. So she held a bit of a whip hand as far as the building was concerned. But it was very interesting. I thought your initial comment about the fact that she had never designed a theatre before, and you were in a similar position. Could you perhaps share with us some of the advantages and disadvantages of not.
Certainly.
maybe
We were approached in 1994 by Hampstead Theatre Club up at Swiss Cottage, occupied but were basically porter cabins. And they were going to have to redevelop because Camden Council was not going to relicense the premises because they were about 15 years beyond their use-by date. The artistic director started talking to architects with a lot of theatre experience and expressed concern to her board that they were telling her what she needed in her new theatre, whereas she wanted to go on a voyage of discovery to work out what she needed and what would work for the theatre. So from memory, there was a short list of 8. Do you remember, Simon?
Yeah,
4 architects with theatre experience and 4 without. And we came through that selection procedure and were appointed. It then took 9 years until we opened the new Hampstead Theatre, partly because of issues with the site and then stages of lottery funding and planning, etc. Having said that, having built one theatre, that clearly stood us in very good stead when we were appointed to do the RST.
You can't play that trick twice, can you? About having not done a theatre before.
No. But I think it is. Sorry, Peter. I think it is a point that good designers are good designers, and they will respond to a client, to a site, and to a project brief as it develops. And it is a voyage of discovery. And the fact is that the nature of what the RSC required, it had aspects of complexion in common with Hampstead, but many, many aspects which are utterly and completely different. So the fact that you've done one doesn't necessarily mean you're suddenly an expert. So, Peter.
I was just going to observe that, I think there are other buildings that fit into this category, but arts buildings do require a collaboration with the creative forces that are in the client team. And to have a competition process that doesn't explore the fact that you want it to be a collaboration would be a really bad thing. I think you could. Elisabeth Scott was lucky to win on just doing a design, I think, and then obviously she had a pretty unique set of skills that let her produce a really nice building. But I really don't think that you should ever go into a competitive process for an arts building where you say, I want people who've already done one. I think what you should do is say, I want people whose experience shows that they're capable of working with their client to do one. I think that's a wildly different thing.
I think the other thing which is very unfair for Elisabeth Scott is that if you look at all 6 final designs, the auditorium is virtually exactly the same. It was clearly a very prescriptive brief that was given as part of the architectural competition. And so, it's one of those things, the client and the collaborators and, Bridges Adams, during the development of the project, were all happy to take the praise. History happens forward, but is recorded backwards. So they were happy as things were proceeding. And then as soon as the carping and criticism came in, suddenly the problem lay with the architect. Whereas any of those architects would have been working to exactly the same template.
I don't think we quite covered this. I tried to cover it when we were talking, but the interesting thing is that what is wrong with that auditorium is that huge dimension between somebody speaking and somebody 30 meters away, which comes from this aspiration for it to be cinema-like, which just can't work. And I think they knew they wanted. I think Flower and the other group of people involved in it, Bridges Adams, they knew they wanted it to be different. They thought the cinema and those kind of big auditoria were the answer, but they just hadn't considered that one thing, that it meant that some people were going to be 30 meters away from the person speaking. And that runs right through theatre, and it's quite interesting when we were doing ours that Michael Boyd, our artistic director, said he didn't really care whether people were comfortable in their seats or not. He didn't want them to be too comfortable. He wanted them to be on the edge of their seat so that they didn't want to sleep and so they could hear the person gasp next to them. And that's not a feature of cinema architecture. Very different.
I was one of those school parties in the early
60s. And the auditorium, I remember it, the stage, the first framework was literally the size of a large matchbox. And there was Judi Dench and David Warner, and we couldn't see them. So we had to go to the stage door afterwards, which is what everybody did, or the Swan.
We can't remember the name of the actor who said this, but there was an actor who said of, an eminent actor in the 1930s, he said of the Memorial Theatre that it was like standing on the cliffs of Dover addressing Calais. and that kind of shouting style comes from dealing with theatres like that, and the more intimate modern style is
because an acting style too, isn't it? I mean, it's like the Olivier, isn't it?
Yeah.
The National, that's called the Olivier for good reason, because he wanted to take the point of command in the middle of the stage, and that's
and you need
different
that
now.
power, and you have to have Olivier's powers of.
And actors today are versatile. They work in film and TV, and they work at a more close-up level,
more intimately.
And so
If you just look at the difference between a cinema seat and a cinema seat, you've got to have room to put your popcorn. You've got to have room so that you don't feel the person next to you. You've got to feel you're sort of slumped in this comfort where the only thing you know is what's on the screen. And good theatre seats are nothing like that. And we had ours designed by a company who made sports car seats because they could get comfort into a really small envelope.
Small space.
And they're just different media. And to expect one architectural form to deal with both of them was probably asking too much, but they didn't know that then. So they ducked and let her take the credit for it.
Plus, of course, a lot of the finance came from the United States.
Yes.
Which, hence the judging panel was split between the UK and the States. So, anybody else like to make?
The first question is about the relationship between the building and the city that you mentioned. It was kind of close to the city in previous plan. How did you deal with that issue and learn a bit more about it? And the other one is the viewing, the tower, if you could talk about it a little bit more. And I was just curious that what was the budget on the whole refurbishment project?
So take those questions in turn. So the relationship with Stratford, of course, had become more and more important as Stratford was seen as the place that people visited as a whole. It wasn't just going to the theatre or going to the church. It was actually about trying to create that relationship with the town. So what we were able to do was to create new dressing room space that wasn't on the town side of the building, to actually remove that block of accommodation that had been known as the Jam Factory facing the town, and create a new glazed foyer space along that side. So that created almost like a street connecting the entrance to the Royal Shakespeare Theatre with the entrance to the Swan Theatre. So those two theatres that we showed you in 2005 weren't actually connected. You had to walk around the outside of the building to get from one to the other. And there was a delivery bay and a car park in between the two. So through removing aspects of buildings, we created literally an internal street connecting the two ends of the building together. That in turn formed part of a route that actually takes you right the way through the gardens and through to the church, and there's a view of the church through an arch within that new internal street. And a theatre square, we've managed to pedestrianise the street outside, which takes you across the road to the town, then up towards Shakespeare's birthplace, so connecting it in. And the tower idea was very much one of, it was about trying to recreate the spirit of that Gothic folly that was in the original 1879 theatre, but also it's simply about circulation, that there are large numbers of people moving up and down within the building. And Scott's fountain staircase that we showed you only connected the dress circle and the stalls. It didn't go up to the balcony because that was the nature of, as we said, segregated theatre designed in the 1930s. So we needed a new stair that connected all the floors together, and that's what we created. And a lift, indeed, because there were no lifts in the front of house of the building either. The budget for the building, the construction budget was 57 million. All right.
tower that was above the bit that you needed to function as a circulation. Didn't cost very much, actually. And what was really interesting was that a lot of people objected to it at first, because as I said to you, Stratford's a very conservative place, and they actually object to any change. And at the moment you could say to them, but there was a tower on the 1880s theatre, which was the most popular, produced the postcard. Well, yours was the postcard. The postcard that sold best in Stratford was the view from the top of the church and the Avon. And we told people that you were recreating a view that had existed before and that people had loved for a generation. They stopped worrying about the fact that it was a tower and they accepted it. And they didn't need to understand all the architectural reasons why it worked. It was just sentimentally they could see that it had a purpose. And the original tower, as I mentioned at the time, on the earlier theatre, it was there to be a viewing tower. It was there to get people to come to the theatre. And our brief, I mean, to get back to the point of how things have to be a collaboration, our brief very explicitly said that we wanted people to come all day long. And there are several solutions in the building. That's a whole other discussion, but the tower makes people come all day long. And then there are informal performances, there's coffee, there's lots of video goes on in the building that is related to performance. So actually it just helps.
I think that reflects, again, the change in the way theatres like this operate now compared to 1932.
Yeah, they weren't even open
Nobody would
all year long.
Nobody would build a theatre now.
All day long.
Nobody would build a theatre now that was only open in the summer.
No.
Theatre buildings work extremely hard, and they're all about trying to get audiences in there all the time, all day, to interact with workshops, to have discussions with directors, to look at rehearsals, to have lunch, to have activities going on all day and night. And that's what modern theatres really are about.
Because they have to be more democratic. They're publicly funded. They have to be for everyone.
Yeah,
and the other side of that is that the public funding needs to be augmented by them being open all day and doing other things.
They have to be more commercial as well. Yeah.
Well, it costs a lot of money to put in the infrastructure of the theatre, whether it be the technical equipment or the refreshment facilities. They've got to work hard. There was one person at the back who suggested he had a question or a comment.
I just wanted to go back briefly to Elisabeth Scott's theatre. No one's addressed the notorious comment that Pevsner made in The Buildings of England, that he had the great pleasure of going around the building when it was new with Walter Gropius.
Yes.
And he says something to the effect that her Gropius found the building puzzling and certainly not modern, whereas Scott thought she was being modern. So what was the balance of criticism at the time when the building was new, not just in the specialist press, but the popular press, the Times and other newspapers? What did they make of it?
Well, I mean, the range of people who wrote about it in the sort of semi-professional areas, I suppose. I mean, John Summerson, Max Fry, Squires, who was a bit more critical. I mean, they saw it as a fresh kind of building. I mean, everybody was already very aware that there was Scandinavian modernism and there was, white modernism. And this was, took much, especially, using the brick as she'd been, almost coerced into doing. It became a building which could well have sat, sort of on in Stockholm without, really any difficulty at all. So, I mean, I think people saw it in that framework. I mean, the modernism that she was talking about was that kind of modernism. And I don't know who would have pushed, who would have been an exemplar to pushing further towards, I mean, you couldn't have had a theatre that looked like the Van Nella factory in Rotterdam, all glass and steel and lit all night. I mean, it wouldn't have been fit for purpose, even if it was the same date. So, I mean, this was the building that worked for the purpose, but had, I mean, the sort of very general judges' response was they liked the simplicity of it. They liked the sort of the linear arrangement of it. That's what people saw as modern, as opposed to modernist, I suppose you'd say.
It's also a very legible building.
Very
legible. Yeah.
So I think, I mean, yes, there were people saying, I mean, Beachcomber said it looked as if it came out of Stalin's Russia. You know, Beachcomber. The burgers, you know, going on about the jam factories. And funny how jam factories, lots of buildings were described as jam factories. It was a favourite one.
That arts people fall over to use jam factories now. Nice windows and roof.
So I mean, I think, you know, if people wanted, and of course Elgar, I mean, you know, I just had a note here of what he actually said. I mean, he wrote over and over, and they were continually, Bridges Adams was saying, you know, don't put this stuff that you're writing to me in print, you know, we just can't have it. And Elgar said, this distressing, vulgar, and abominable building, a punishment inflicted on poor Stratford and us by that awful female. And William Bridges Adams just sort of, you know, he was really a viper, you know. He wrote to Elgar, he said, I'm not overpleased with it. What's overpleased mean? I mean, and you know, when it suited him earlier on, as Denise was saying, you know, he was taking the credit. It was his theatre. He designed, he was writing the brief. So, you know, he's backing away as fast as his little feet could take him. You know, it's not surprising they got rid of him quite quickly. I mean, he was a serpent. The laws of libel will allow me to say that.
Can I just say, I mean, if you work in the visual arts, modern covers a whole bigger range of things than modern does in architecture, and I think this is modern more in that sense than it is in that kind of international modern sense. It's a kind of British modern that's rather nice and has carried on in other places. I think she was probably. I was talking to Simon. There's another building in Stratford, the Shakespeare Centre, built in the 1960s, which is in British terms modern, but probably not modern in other terms, which has that same character of being filled with beautiful interiors by craftsmen, and actually that's kind of in a way follows in that tradition, and I just think you just can't compartmentalise it in that way. It shouldn't be. It's something else.
Well, I think, I mean, it is interesting that you know, that short interval between leaving here and winning the competition, de Soissons and Oliver Hill, who were both preeminently the kind of architects who just did the work according to what the brief and the building type was, and didn't appear to kind of have, they weren't parti pris in you know, if Oliver Hill wanted to do a seaside estate in Frinton, he did it white with flat roofs, and jolly good it still looks. But, you know, he seemed to be able to do quite a lot of other things, and de Soissons similarly, you know, was Dartington stuff is very modernist. Really, you know, white modernist, but not, it's not necessarily the right thing in for the next job. And I think, you know, she was sort of picking that up from her, you know, her employers. Our colleagues.
Would anyone else like to add anything?
Just one final remark about modernisms. It's just that when the history of 20th century architecture was written, it was Gropius's white modernism that was privileged. And I think that goes a long way for explaining why Elisabeth Scott was hidden from history.
Yeah. I think that's right. Yes.
I think also, you know, there was just the damnation, which was the Depression and then the Second World War. You know, who knows where her career might have gone if she had actually carried on in practice. She was clearly doing a wide range of project types, which was, you know, very, very interesting, and embracing aspects of technology as it was coming in. She was clearly very open-minded and collaborative. It's just a pity that the circumstances outside of her control, as well as people who were trying to decry the past, got in the way. But I'd like to say thank you to everyone for coming. It's been a fascinating evening. I thought I knew a little bit about Scott, but I've learned an awful lot more tonight. So I'd like to thank Gillian and Simon and Peter. And the final thing I have to do is to remind people that the final lecture in this series is next Tuesday evening. It's going to be Lisa Fior and I hope I can pronounce Zaida Muhi Martinez. And they're going to be talking urban design from a gendered perspective. So I hope people will come to it. Thank you very much indeed.